Good afternoon, everyone. In the last lecture, we talked about Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is one of the most influential early modern thinkers, and as I mentioned last class, many of his ideas trickle down into the minds of the founding fathers of our country, the most influential of whom were very well versed in the modern trends in philosophy, and that would have been Hobbes at this time, amongst others. And of course they were also well versed in the classical tradition as well. Now the Hobbesian mindset certainly survives today in some subtle ways if we have the eyes to see it. Now, take for example two of the gravest social ills in our society, divorce and abortion. Even the staunchest defenders of these institutions usually admit, at least when they're speaking in public, that both of them are necessary evils that should be avoided whenever possible, but permitted nonetheless. This is the rhetoric anyway. Since it is the political season, we could recall Hillary Clinton's famous statement that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Let's take a Hobbesian perspective on these issues. What do we get if we remove any natural basis for relationships between husband and wife and parent and child? Think about Aristotle as a contrast. He recognized a sort of friendship that exists naturally between certain individuals. Men and women, he said, have a natural affinity and complementarity between them that makes their life together good, pleasant, and useful. Parents and children, although clearly unequals, also have a natural affinity to one another based on other considerations. Parents have a natural benevolence towards their children, and children have a sort of natural gratitude and piety or reverence towards their parents. But for Hobbes, all relationships are contractual and based solely on furthering the interests of each party individually. If the contract is no longer to my perceived advantage, I'm permitted, obligated we might say, to throw aside this obligation regardless of the effect on the other person. There is no nature, phusis here, just conventional agreement, nomos. And let's recall how we calculate our advantage according to Hobbes. It's measured in the attainment of our own private desires, whatever they may be. So if our marriage is no longer advantageous to us, however we define advantage, we break the contract on the grounds that we can't be held to a contract that has become disadvantageous for one reason or another. In the case of having children, a mother's right to pursue her own interests can't be compromised by an obligation to the child in question, especially if the child were the result of an unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, or even more dramatically, in the cases of rape and incest that we hear brought up so often in these debates. I would submit that the way many people talk about these issues is at least tinged by the Hobbesian outlook, even if it's a rather softened version of it. Not many people would say that they go all the way with Hobbes, probably, if they knew. And it's not surprising to see more and more pro-abortion arguments, for example, if you pay attention to these things, that explicitly rely on these sort of Hobbesian presuppositions. Elements of Hobbes, once again in a softened form, are in the very air that we breathe as Americans. Now much more could be said here, but let's move on to what you read for today, David Hume. We've seen Hume mentioned already when we read A Refutation of Moral Relativism. You may want to look back to pages 43 to 45 of that work to see Craiff's take on Hume. Now Hobbes is writing right around the time of René Descartes in the mid-17th century, which is usually considered the beginning of what we call the modern period of philosophy. Hume comes 100 years later or so, writing in the mid-18th century, not the 17th century. So we're skipping ahead a bit in the modern period from Hobbes to Hume. Now what we see in Hume is an extreme form of what we call empiricism, a term we've already seen. Empiricism, the way we usually describe it, says that all knowledge must be derived from sense experience. Now this by itself is not very controversial. Aristotle and Aquinas would agree. But an extreme form of empiricism, like Hume defended, holds additionally that in the end, knowledge never really reaches beyond sense experience. In the reading, we see Hume's empiricism expressed when he remarks that nothing is ever present to the mind but its perceptions. And as he notes, perceptions resolve themselves into two kinds, namely impressions and ideas. Now what he seems to mean here is the difference between primary sense experience, which he calls impressions, and the faint images of impressions, which he calls ideas. And we could see this distinction if we simply tap on the desk in front of us, or the table, or whatever is in front of you. If you do that, what you're hearing is, I think, what Hume would call an impression. Now, a minute later, you could reflect on those impressions. You could recall them, and the sort of faint image of them, and that would be an idea of the tapping. Now, there's one other fundamental distinction that we should note in order to see where Hume is coming from. Let's think about two statements that we would say are false. First, the sun will not rise tomorrow. Second, a bachelor is not a man. Are these statements both false? Yes. How do we know that each is false? Well, there seems to be a difference here between the two. Let's take the first. Is it conceivable, thinkable, imaginable that the sun will not rise tomorrow? We would have to say yes. It's very unlikely that the sun won't rise tomorrow, but it's possible, it's conceivable. I suppose it would be very cold and dark, for example. Maybe even physically impossible, since I suppose we'd be dead if the sun weren't around anymore. But it's ultimately conceivable, and that's the important part. What about a bachelor who's not a man? Is this possible? Is this conceivable? No, it's not. If someone were not a man, this person could no longer be a bachelor, since part of being a bachelor is being a man by the very definition. Now these two statements exemplify two types or sources of knowledge that we have, and this is rather interesting about knowledge. This is what he was talking about. The first we would call a matter of fact. This is something that is known, what we say in philosophy, a posteriori. That is, it's a Latin phrase that means from what is posterior, or afterwards. We know the sun will rise tomorrow because we've seen it rise the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that, etc. Now this is a type of knowledge, but it's not completely and absolutely certain. We need experience in order to do that, and that's why we call it posterior to our experience. Now on the other hand, there are some things that we know the opposite, a priori, that is, from what is prior to experience. We don't need experience to know. Now we don't need experience, we don't need to experience many different bachelors to conclude that a bachelor is a man. It would be a contradiction to say in conversation that you have a friend who's a bachelor and then later refer to this person as her, she or her. Okay, so these are the basic philosophical distinctions. These two types are the distinctions that Hume is making in his empiricism. Now let's turn to his moral philosophy, which is of course what we're concerned with here. But you'll see that these two distinctions that I've just made are going to come up in the language that he uses. But the conclusion that he's going to come to in his moral philosophy that you read for today is described in philosophy as a type of emotivism, which means that moral judgments are ultimately derived from feelings or emotions. A corresponding claim would be that reason alone cannot distinguish between right and wrong. Reason, Hume famously says in another place, is the slave of the passions. We don't have a much stronger statement of emotivism than that. Let's try to get a sense of how he reaches this conclusion. The first possibility that he explores is the claim that morality does come from reason. He refers to those who affirm that virtue is nothing but a conformity to reason. Now, who do you think he has in mind here? It sounds a lot like Aristotle, doesn't it? The way that he sets up the argument, however, suggests that he probably has more of his Hume's contemporaries' views in mind. But this language does sound, in the face of it, like it would apply to Aristotle. At any rate, the question here that he explicitly raises is whether it be possible from reason alone to distinguish betwixt moral good and evil. Now, reason, he notes, has to do with what is true or false, and for him, as we've seen, that means that it must have to do with either relations of ideas or matters of fact. So where is virtue and vice to be found? In relations of ideas or matters of fact? He begins with relations of ideas, and here we want to focus on some of the examples that I drew your attention to in the study questions. Let's take the example of parricide, that is, killing your father, which Hume points out is a species, a kind of ingratitude, the extreme form. Killing your father is being very ungrateful to him because you owe your existence to him. But isn't this same situation exemplified by the sapling of an oak tree that overgrows and kills the tree that produced it? Now, there are obvious differences between these two cases, between the humans and the oak trees, but Hume maintains that what reason alone discovers in each case is the same: the relation of an offspring killing its parent. Now, once again, these relations have different causes: natural causes in the case of an oak, and volitional causes in the case of a human being. But the relation discovered by reason is exactly the same, he says. And it's the same for the case of incest, which we don't blame in the case of brute animals, but are disgusted by in the case of human beings. What's the difference? The relation discovered by reason, he claims, is exactly the same. The disgust or baseness imputed to the act in human beings, or turpitude, as Hume calls it, is independent of reason. Reason only recognizes something that's already there. But where is the badness, the vice of parricide and incest, or willful murder, as Hume is also going to bring up? If these vices, as he calls them, are not in a relation of ideas, perhaps they're in the other province of reason, matters of fact. Let's take a look at what we observe in a bad, blameworthy act. Now, Hume uses the example of willful murder, as I've said, but let's take a simpler example of theft. Let's say you see Tom stealing $20 from Jane's purse. Now, this is a blameworthy act, a crime, a vice, as Hume calls it. But, as he asks, examine it in all lights and see if you can find that matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. Now, giving even an exhaustive physical description of the event will never mention this vice, the badness of this act of theft. Hume would perhaps say, if the wrongness of theft is a thing in the outside world, point to it, show it to me, describe it. Does it have a color? Does it have a shape, etc.? No, it doesn't. And the reason that it doesn't is because the badness or wrongness or vice of any act is only in the subjective response of the one who observes it. It is merely a feeling or sentiment of the individual. Now let me read this section on page 96 at length, because it brings this point out forcefully, I think. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You never can find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you towards this action. Here is a matter of fact, but it is the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself, not in the object, so that when you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but that from the constitution of your nature you have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it. So this is why we call Hume an emotivist and subjectivist, and why he rightly deserves a spot in the Relativism Hall of Fame, you could say. Morality is, for him, placed squarely in the subject, not the objective world. But he's not done. These feelings, we learn, are ultimately reducible to the pleasure that we feel when we see someone act virtuously, and the pain we feel when we see someone act viciously. So this is also a sort of philosophical hedonism, in the sense that pleasure and pain make the whole thing go. Of course, as he notes, it's only certain types of pleasures and pains that occasion moral judgment. The pleasure of enjoying a good bottle of wine, for example, doesn't. But you'll notice that Hume was perhaps not quite willing to follow the consequences of his theory home, so to speak. He wants to save something of an objective morality in spite of his subjectivist explanations. He also, of course, has to explain why most people in the world feel pleasure and pain at the same types of moral acts. Now, in order to account for all this, Hume appeals to what he calls sympathy, which he describes by saying, "The minds of all men are similar in their feelings and operations, nor can any one be actuated by any affection of which all others are not, in some degree, susceptible." So we're all hardwired, I guess you could say, to have the same moral feelings or sentiments, as he puts it. Now perhaps Hume's most important contribution to the moral philosophy that comes after him, especially in contemporary philosophy, is what we call now the fact-value split, or gap. The problem here, as he points out on page 96, is how we can derive an ought from an is. That is, how we can move from a description of facts to a statement of what is now called a value. How do we reason from facts to values? Let's take an example of a statement of fact that could happen to us. Let's say, the bank gave me $20 extra when they cashed my check. That's a statement of fact. How do we move from this statement to a statement of values, such as, I ought to return the $20 to the bank? Now there's a chasm here between facts and values that, according to Hume, cannot be reconciled. And the reason for this is presumably because, as we've seen, according to Hume, facts and values have two different origins. Well, facts are plainly observable through the senses. Values are projected onto facts. And where does this projection come from? We know his answer. Feelings of pleasure or pain, the emotions. Okay, we'll leave it here for today. Next class, we'll be talking about the philosopher whose main task it was to pick up the pieces of philosophy that Hume's hammer left in its wake. This is Immanuel Kant. I'll talk to you tomorrow.